Yeah, if you don't have a Bible, keep one. Keep this one as our gift to you. Anybody else? Yeah. So last week, we sort of introduced this phrase that we build too many walls and not enough bridges, and little did we know that would sort of manifest itself in our state. And what we kind of know is that life has a way of pulling us away from ourselves, from each other, from God, and the solution to all of this, the bridge to all of this, is not more rules or guilt or effort. It's grace, and that's what we looked at last week. That grace bridges the gap our choices create. Grace bridges the gap our choices create. And so we dove into this story that's 2,000 years old. It's actually a parable, a series of 3 stories in one parable that I think gives us new light on how we navigate this in our world. It's a great chapter, and it's probably my favorite section in the scriptures because it's this beautiful summary of what's on God's heart. You want to know what's on God's heart? Luke 15 gives us that. And so the parable is comprised of 3 stories of lost things. Story 1 is lost sheep. Story number 2 is a lost coin or lost silver coin. And story number 3 is a couple of lost sons. And so we're going to pick that up, one of these guys we're going to look at today in this third parable. And so Luke 15, verse 11 says this, and he said, a man, and he being Jesus, and he said, a man had 2 sons. Verse 12, the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that is coming to me. Now, to truly understand this story, we have to understand what this son just did to his father. Culturally, this is how this process was supposed to work. At this time in the ancient Near Eastern society, whenever a father died, the oldest son would be set to inherit like 2/3 of the family estate, 2/3 of the wealth, 2/3 of the property. And the younger kids, or in this situation, the younger son, would receive 1/3 of the father's wealth and property. So what we have here is a son, the younger son, who is impatient for his dad's death. And this is the phrase I want you to sort of to latch on to, because I think this sort of summarizes the subtext below this part of this story. So technically, this younger son, he's at home with the father. Technically, he's at home with the father, but in reality, his heart is all away already in a distant land. And you're going to see that over and over again. Technically, the son, he is home with his dad. But in reality, his heart is somewhere else. It's already away. It's already moved away to a distant land. He's got to get out of the situation that he feels is restricting him. Too many cooks in the kitchen for him. He's got to leave this home that he believes is holding him back. Now, the idea that Jesus is starting to lift up here, to illustrate here, I think in some ways is similar to the issues that we're dealing with right now in America, and especially a few minutes down the road in Minneapolis. When we think about the First Amendment, the right to free speech, and our ability to exercise that through protest. And I want to point this out because I think for many what's happening represents just one of the most recent expressions of our larger discussion around what freedoms we have and do not have, what we should have or should not have, and then what we should do or not do when it comes to when those freedoms get infringed upon. So before ICE in Minneapolis, we were talking about, not too long ago, freedoms around trucker convoys in Canada. Before that, we were talking about vaccines and masks. Before that, we were talking about the freedom to protest at the nation's capital, about social justice across our nation. If you remember, in fact, a few years ago, the conversation around Elon Musk buying Twitter was one of the hottest topics that we had in America when it came to what it means to have freedom of press and freedom of speech. And I list all that not because I want to get political in this message. Some of you on both sides would like to get more political, but I don't see the need to. Rather, my point is to point out our obsession with personal freedom. I list all those things not because I have a particular stance on them, but rather to highlight our compulsion to throw off the restraints of others who we believe are keeping us from being who and doing what we think we should be and do. Our deep desire is to break away from those who who we feel are restricting our freedom and holding us back. And that includes people, that includes government, and I submit to you that it also includes God. But unlike airlines and agencies and courts who can mandate certain behaviors from us, God doesn't do that. In fact, as we're about to see from the Father in this story, sometimes the grace God gives us is actually the freedom to burn down our bridge to Him. Sometimes the freedom He gives us is actually the ability to go find out what life is like outside of His house. And we do that when we view the Father, when we view God as the one who is restricting our freedom and not providing it. We see it in the rest of verse 12. Look at it again. The younger of them, the younger son, said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the estate that is coming to me." And so the dad did it. So he divided his wealth between them. 13. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey to a distant country. Now, this son, he's finally broken free, and he's wandering off to who he thinks he needs to be. Now, normally, sermons about this passage go in a very particular direction because the obvious application is toward people who have already become prodigals and may or may not recognize that they've wandered into a distant land or they're far from home, maybe into a place that they never thought they would be. That's normally where these sermons tend to go, toward the prodigal, those that have walked away from something. But I think there's another group. I think there's another group that this is applicable to, another group in the church who this passage has a poignant message for, because if we're honest with ourselves, and this isn't all of us, but I think it's some of us, the reason some of us haven't wandered off into a distant land, the reason that some of us haven't wandered off into some sin is not because we've been so interested in being obedient to God, but rather because we simply lack the opportunity. I've been a pastor for like 3 decades almost now, and I've seen this dynamic play out over and over again with a lot of different demographics. I've seen kids who grow up in church, some of them who are really good at following rules, and they've gotten good grades, and they've done some really good activities that's really gonna look good on their college application, and everybody around them sort of reinforces the idea that they're a really good person who does really good things because they've done a really good job at keeping up good appearances. Some people even label these kids as church kids or youth group kids or Christian kids. And they've been able to do all this because the eyeballs of authority have been looking at them, keeping them in line. But they've determined that the second they're out the door, the second they get to college, the moment they leave the house and are outside the view of the watchful eyes in their lives, they've already decided in their hearts that they're going to break free and do all the things that they've not done yet. You see, experiencing this prodigal moment was just simply a lack of opportunity for them. Technically, they're at home with the Father, but in reality, their heart is away already in a distant land. And this sort of suppressed prodigal son experience isn't just limited to kids. For some church ladies, the only reason they haven't had an affair is because they simply haven't had the right man acknowledge them at the right moment. When that old boyfriend, they reconnect on social media while nobody's watching, decides to direct message them, and well, who knows what might happen. But until then, it's simply just the fear of consequences. It's the fear of maintaining appearances and a stack of books or a queue of movies or social media reels that allow them to indulge the fantasy. And that'll have to do for now. I've seen that. Technically, they're at home. They're at home, but in reality, their heart is away already in a distant land. For some men, the reason that they haven't engaged in some shady business deal so far is not simply because they're so good, but rather the right person hasn't come along with the right proposal just yet. It's not because they're committed to this moral integrity or honoring God with vocation. It's the only thing's holding them back is just opportunity. It hasn't happened yet. Technically, they're at home with the Father, but in reality, their heart is away already in a distant land. And I think that subset in the church is an application for this part of the story. Because I know it's true. I know it happens. I know my tendencies and I know yours as well. It's true for us. It's true for the prodigal son as well. This conversation that he has with his dad, it's not just a spur of the moment idea that he has. It's not some spontaneous opportunity that comes to him. He's been deliberating on this for quite some time now. The outcome was inevitable because when he believes that there's something way better out there that he doesn't have access to, that God's keeping from him, it's only a matter of time before we get up and go after that thing. And that's what happens to this son in the story. Look at verse 13. Verse 13 says, not many days later, after he had this conversation with his dad, the decision was made. It didn't take long to execute the plan. Not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together. He loaded all his belongings up on a U-Haul truck, and he went on a journey to a distant country, and there he squandered his estate in wild living. Now, this word living is an interesting word in the Greek language that this story was originally written in. It's the word from where we get our word biography. In other words, he packs up all his belongings and he goes to some Middle Eastern, Las Vegas-like city to write a wild story with his life. And that's what he does, or that's what he thinks he's doing, until he begins to understand the reality that real freedom is only found with the Father. But unfortunately, this lesson was an expensive one for him to learn, because look at verse 14. When he had spent, how much? When he had spent everything. A severe famine occurred in that country, and he began going without. Now, the dynamic here seems very strange to us a little bit. And in some ways, it's very familiar to us. I mean, he gave everything he had to get what he thought he wanted, and he got it for a while until the law of diminishing returns took over, and he was still giving. He was giving and giving and giving until what he got in return ended up being nothing. He ends up with absolutely nothing, even though he had given absolutely everything to this pursuit. And I wonder, as we reflect on our own lives, how many of us have found ourselves in a similar story like that? It's a tale as old as time, really, which is why I can't tell you how many times I've talked with men who with tears in their eyes have said to me, I can't believe I traded my family for a fling. Or I can't believe I traded my marriage for a series of computer clicks. I can't tell you how many women I've met who have so much regret from chasing other people's dreams and other people's ideas and expectations for them instead of chasing after Jesus. People who thought that if they had the right amount of money in the bank, or people who thought that if they could just live in the right neighborhood, at whatever the cost, if they could just get that thing that was just way out there in that distant land, that they would be happy, that they would be satisfied, that they would be fulfilled. What I thought would be an end-all, be-all, we find out wasn't actually anything at all. And when we realize this, we find ourselves in a pretty desperate situation, which is where we find ourselves in the story in verse 15. Look at it. He says, so he went, the young son, he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens in that country. And he sent he sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he, the son, and he longed to have his fill of the caropods that the pigs were eating. Now, we're about 2,000 years removed from this context, and it's still nasty, no matter how you spin it. But I think it's kind of difficult for us that far removed to understand how devastating this moment was for this young man. I mean, remember, Jesus is telling the story to a Jewish audience who would have definitely been keeping kosher eating practices. So this part of the story would have been the throw up in your mouth moment of the story. Jesus is painting this horrific, maybe the most horrific picture possible of what rock bottom looks like for this group. A young Jewish boy who by Torah law is not allowed to eat pigs because according to the Old Testament law, it was nasty, unclean for them to do so. And so he's so hungry. He's so destitute. He's so low that he's not just willing to eat pig. He's bypassing that. He's willing to eat after pigs have eaten. He would have been happy just to eat what they were eating. But that's not even possible in this story. Look at verse 16. And he longed to have his fill of the carob pods that the pigs were eating, and no one was giving him anything. Now, if this story would have been ended here, which would have been fascinating, it would have still served its purpose as a cautionary tale. And I'm guessing that's exactly where most of the original hearers would have thought this story was going to stop, which kind of makes us ask the question as we look at our own life, that might be how we think about our own stories, that's where the story stops, that it just got worse, and then that's how it's going to be forever. But Jesus says 7 words in the next verse that turns this tragedy into a story of hope. Look at it with me. Verse 17 says, but when he came to his senses, the son, when he came to his senses. I love that. The literal translation of this verse is, but when he came to himself, when he came to himself. Ladies and gentlemen, that is so good. That's so good. What this young man experienced in this moment was an aha moment for him. Why? Because in that moment, he came to himself. He finds a bridge back to himself, to who he really is, to who he actually was all along. He took a hard look at himself, and in doing so, he realized that he wasn't acting like the person that he was supposed to be. And he realized about himself that what he'd become in the distant land, it doesn't change who he is. That what he had done, it doesn't change whose he is. He's always going to be the Father's son. Even though he thought the bridge to true and lasting freedom was to cast off those loving restraints of the Father, even though he attempted to compose his own biography on his own terms, to write a wild story with his own life, it didn't mean for him that it had to be his final chapter. It wasn't the end of the story, because he came to himself, which means a new chapter can be written, and it can start being written right now. But when he came to himself, that was the aha moment for this guy. And the aha that happened for him that day can happen for all of us today as well. That as you look at your own life story, maybe God's grace to you was actually that he let you leave home. Not because he wanted you to fail, not because he wanted you to falter, but because he wanted you to find that true freedom is only going to be found with the Father. Maybe God gave you the grace of space so that you could cross the bridge back to him, so that you could come to yourself and realize that the person you were trying to become by leaving was exactly who you were already. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this story. We thank you for who you have made us. that you have called us your sons and your daughters. And God, I pray that you begin to help us to realize more and more what that means. And even though we may not have gone to Las Vegas to write the wild story with our life, for many of us, our hearts are far from you. And so, God, I pray that we begin to realize who we've been the whole time, your kids, and that we would begin to come to our own selves in that state. And then when we know who we are, we begin to know what to do. Help us to live into that truth. Help us to live into that reality more than ever before. That the freedom that we're looking for is not going to be found outside of your home, outside of a relationship with you. That casting off the restraints is not the way that we find the freedom that we long for. And so, God, we give ourselves to you today. We need you. We need you more than ever before. We need you to help us in times when we forget who we are to you, to remind us that you love us more than we will ever know. God, we need you. We need you in that process. We need you to help us do that. And we thank you for Jesus, who told us this story and who showed us with his own life what you're like. We need him. We pray these things in his name. And all God's people said, amen. Let's stand as we sing our closing song.